This is PTV Volt. I am SYED SHABAHAT, and you're watching Fault Lines. The war between Ukraine and Russia has turned out to be one of the landmark events in the contemporary history of Europe. After the Second World War, this war has caused maximum damage to the European economy and also has created an influx of refugees, the largest recorded after World War II in the heartland of Europe. Uh, this war is divided into several battles as none of the two sides have been able to quickly overcome the other. Neither the Russians have been able to conquest Ukraine in a short period of time, nor Ukraine has been able to push out Russia entirely. So the war is divided into many small battles, and the recent one concluded is the Battle of Bakhmut, which has favorably ended in favor of Russia. Now, Russia believes that it is one of the major accomplishments of its military. Europe, on the contrary, has increased the supply of ammunition to Ukraine. Also, there are news confirming that F-16s will now be provided to Ukraine for a stronger hold in the air. What exactly is happening in this battle? Team Fault Lines have prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
The conflict in Ukraine has dramatically changed the world and is shaping future of Europe and global security order in decisive manner. The intense fighting around eastern city of Bakhmut has been the longest and bloodiest in more than a year-long Ukraine conflict, which has devastated swaths of Ukraine and displaced millions of people. Russia appeared close to taking control of Bakhmut this week, although Ukraine said it continued to fight on in the southwest fringes of the city of largely devastated by an intense year of deadly fighting. The Battle of Bakhmut has increasingly been the focal point of the war. Now its 65th week, Bakhmut was first shelled in May 2022 and Russian forces consistently targeted the mining city that had a pre-war population of about 70,000. Although not considered of particular strategic value, the city has acquired a high symbolic value of both sides in the conflict. Western arms supplies to Ukraine reached another inflection point this week as United States President Joe Biden backed the joint allied training of Ukrainian pilots on F-16 fighter jets. The G7 signed off on new sanctions against Russia, targeting its energy, metallurgical, technology, and defense industry. With fighting raging on and no peace talks on horizon, Ukraine conflict has become most challenging geopolitical flashpoint, which threatens to escalate great power tensions.
Ladies and gentlemen, my first guest joining me from Texas is Gabriel Nerona. Gabriel is former advisor to State Department and is an expert of the matters of Ukraine and Russia. He also speaks Russian language. Gabriel, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Ali.
Gabriel, what is happening in Bakhmut? Exactly how do you see these developments as both the sides are having different claims about the battle?
Well, Bakhmut is a relatively strategically unimportant city in the Donbass region, but it's become an important symbolic fight between Ukraine and Russian forces. The Wagner Group, which is sort of this paramilitary group, now says that it's lost about 20,000 soldiers killed in the process of trying to take Bakhmut. And it appears that Russia has now almost effectively taken full control over the city. There may be pockets of resistance here and there, but for all intents and purposes, Ukraine is now focusing elsewhere. And now the big thing is that there's been this long promised spring offensive by Ukraine. It's unclear whether that's going to be sort of a massive strike or if it's more of a gradual process. But I think their goals are going to be to take out the land bridge between Russia and Crimea that has been Russia's key strategic goal. But it remains to be seen whether Ukraine has the ability to actually make any substantial gains soon.
Do you actually believe this is a state of stalemate between the two sides, as we don't see any major shift in this war so far?
No, it does appear to be an effective stalemate. The victories that are going to be rather short and mild at this point, partly because both sides are running out of the long-range advanced munitions that you need to make substantial progress in this war. There's trenches on both sides of the line of control that make progress very difficult for either side. Now, there's a possibility that one side sort of breaks through and then can flank the other side. But again, we've seen almost no movement in the past 6 months. And what a lot of people are suspecting is that this is going to turn more into a frozen conflict, something like what we saw in Ukraine in 2014, or in Korea after the Korean War, where there's sort of an uneasy line of control and no formal peace.
Gabriel, we were talking about the fresh round of supplies given by European partners to Ukraine. Do you think it's going to make any difference?
It will help Ukraine again fend off the Russian onslaught. Again, it's important to remember Russia is 3 to 4 times larger than Ukraine. They were supposed to have the world's third largest military, and so those weapons that the NATO is sending is important just to keep Ukraine alive and afloat. But we're not sending the advanced long-range munitions that Ukraine is asking for that would allow it to strike into Russia and really change Russia's calculus. So the issue is that the United States and the rest of NATO isn't appearing to actually try to win the war. They're trying to limit Russia's advances, but they're not giving Ukraine what it needs to actually have a decisive victory here.
And Gabriel, don't you agree that Russia has resisted far more than expected in this war? Perhaps it has resisted more than what United States and allies could have expected.
I think in the last 6 months, I thought that Ukraine was going to take more territory than it has. Russia's really dug in. But look, Russia's goals at the beginning of the war were to take over Kyiv, to install a new government, and to basically entirely separate Ukraine from NATO. It has completely failed and, in fact, sort of reversed those goals in every single respect. Ukraine now has one of the most formidable armies in the world. They are closer to NATO now than ever, and President Zelensky is welcomed in capitals around the world as a sort of a war hero. So Russia's strategic aims have completely failed here. They are just playing for scraps now, trying to hold on to as much Ukrainian territory as they can.
And do you believe sanctions have worked out nicely or worked out effectively against Russia? Because it was one of the primary weapons that the West was using against Russia.
Unfortunately, they've been rather quite ineffective. In 2021, before the war started, Russia exported about $120 billion worth of oil. Last year, it exported $180 billion worth under sanctions. Their economic growth is actually set to increase this year by about 0.8%, and then next year by almost 3%. So the sanctions have not been strict. They have not been enforced well. Again, the West has not been really willing to take serious measures to, again, win the war. They're putting some costs on Russia, but not nearly enough to, again, make a really substantial strategic change in Putin's calculus here.
Do you actually believe Europe is still enthusiastic about supply of ammunition to Ukraine? Because it apparently has not worked very well for Ukraine so far.
They never wanted this war, with a few exceptions from Eastern Europe and the United Kingdom. Europe hasn't done the necessary things to help Ukraine win the war. They want it to end soon. Again, this is more Western and Southern Europe. They don't want this to be their problem. They'd much rather have this go away. They want to focus on other things. And so it's a really important question to see whether Europe itself has the resolve to continue this effort and stand with Ukraine as long as Russia has. So it's sort of a battle of wills here, whether the Russian public will turn on Putin and really sour on this war first, or whether European and American resolve will falter first. I think it's an actual problem and outstanding question that it's not entirely clear to me what is the answer there.
And Gabriel, and just tell us quickly, what do you believe is the biggest challenge for the Ukrainians in this war?
Well, look, Ukraine has taken substantial battlefield losses. They have used huge numbers of munitions, and they need to be able to sustain that rate of munitions and advanced weaponry able to hit targets inside Russia. The issue for Ukraine is the status quo does not help them. The status quo is that they have lost huge amounts of their territory, that Russia's military can continue to threaten them and could invade them tomorrow. You know, if there were a ceasefire tomorrow, Russians could just invade again. So Ukraine's in a very precarious situation. The status quo, again, is a loss for them. It's not a victory, it's a complete loss.
Thank you very much, Gabriel Nerona, for being guest in the program.
Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, This was Gabriel Norona, and now I'm joined by Mohammed Taimur, who is joining me on Skype from Islamabad. He's an expert of Russian affairs and frequently appears in fault lines. Taimur, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Taimur, your take on what is happening on Bakhmut at the moment?
Well, as per the Russian news agencies and Russian media, Russian armed forces have actually taken control of the entire territory of the town of Bakhmut, a city of 70,000 residents before the February 22nd invasion of Ukraine by Russian armed forces. But after a 10 months long of atrocious and atrocious war over the town of Bakhmut, Russians are claiming that they have specifically and categorically taken control of the town. However, the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian leadership still claims that the Russians are spreading misinformation about the control over Bakhmut. And in fact, the Ukrainian armed forces still control a segment of the Bakhmut town in its southeastern region. Although the geo location of the town, it shows that the Russians have actually surrounded the town and taken control of the town from three sides, while on one side, the Ukrainian armed forces are still putting up a stiff resistance against the Russian armed forces.
Taimur, there was a news item that I was reading in the newspaper which reads that USA blamed Ukraine for an attack in the border town of Belgorod. And it said that there is a counter-terrorism operation also running in this part of the country. What exactly is happening there?
Well, the Russian media or the Russian side, especially the special representative or the representative of the president of Russia, Mr. Dmitry Peskov, according to his statements, he said that these are Ukrainian militants or the Russian-speaking Ukrainian militants, which are being claimed as Russian citizens by the Ukrainian leadership, have attacked the border region of Belgorod inside of Russia. And the Russian claim that they have actually neutralized 70 Ukrainian militants, which are actually part of the Russian volunteers group, which are actually being stated that this group consists of ethnic Russian-speaking individuals who are also Russian citizens, who are anti-Kremlin activists and militants who are now being housed inside of Ukraine, or who actually turned against the Kremlin policy and they went into Ukraine and joined the Ukrainian armed forces, especially in 2014 after the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula by Russia. But it is a fact that these people are Russian citizens and they are extremely disgruntled with the policies of President Putin. And now they have joined the Ukrainian rank and file and now launching a resistance against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And now on Monday, they launched a major attack inside of the Russian territory, although it was a border region, but still they entered there, they managed to kill or neutralize a few members of the Russian armed forces, which were actually the reservists who were deployed there. And they also attacked the offices of the Interior Ministry and also the office of the FSB, the Russian intelligence. And the group also claims that they also managed to capture a very small part of a border region as well. But the Russian side, it completely denies such reports, but the Ukrainian side actually endorses this development. And the important fact here is that you have to understand that this was the second major attack that the group launched. Earlier in March, on March 2nd, they launched their initial attack inside the Russian territory in the Bryansk region. But it was not that big. It was of a very small scale, but the attack carried out on Monday was of a big scale and carries a lot of significance, especially while the Ukraine war continues to rage on.
Taimur, the new supply of ammunition and some new weapons to Ukraine have also started. Perhaps it's an outcome of the Battle of Bakhmut, but how is it going to affect the war at large?
Well, you have to understand that on the tactical level, these military supplies or equipment that is being supplied by the Western allies of Ukraine in its fight against Russia carries a lot of significance. But according to General Mark Milley, who's the United States Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff, according to him, he says that this is going to be a protracted war. And there is no such sort of a magic weapon. Actually, he was referring to the provision of F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. He said that there is no such sort of a magic weapon that can actually create, you can say, create miracles in this war. And it is going to be a war of attrition, and it is going to extend for a prolonged period of time. And this statement was further corroborated by not Dmitry, but Medvedev, who's the chairman of the Russian Security Council. He also said that the Ukraine war is not a short war, and it is going to last for at least decades, in which there are going to be periods of truces, and then the war is going to initiate again. And he says that this cycle is going to continue for several years, even spanning over several decades. So I think that the Ukrainians are, you can say, consciously or subconsciously aware of this fact that although the supplies provided by the Western allies are important, but on a larger scale, they are still insignificant. And the Ukrainian president keeps on lobbying for more advanced weaponry so that they can target Russian installations and Russian armed forces inside the Russian territory in order to have some strong, tangible gains in their defense against Russia. So I think that, yes, for incremental periods of time, these supplies are important. But for a prolonged period of time, I don't think so that they are very much significant, and Ukraine would definitely require some state-of-the-art technology in order to have some significant effect against Russia.
And as you said, Taimur, if this war is going to continue for a very long period of time, how is it going to affect the two sides?
Well, for Russia, you have to understand that initially the Russian strategy was of the Blitzkrieg strategy, that they are going to come, they are going to launch an attack on Kiev, and they are going to achieve their targets, and then they are going to execute their own policy or their own strategy that they had in mind. But since that didn't work out, and it turned out to be a complete failure only within a time span of the first 2 months after February 22 last year, Russians changed their strategy and they dug up for a protracted war. And I think first it was not in favor of Russia to have a protracted war, but now that their defense capabilities or their offensive capabilities and their attack capabilities are depleting slowly and gradually because of this war that has continued for more than 14 months now, they have changed their strategy. And I think it is in their favor that as long as this war stretches out, they will be in a better position to restock, to resupply, and regroup their forces so that they can have some substantial, they can carry out some important and substantial offensive attacks against Ukraine and have some important gains in the battlefield as well. And for Ukraine, I don't think so that this bodes well. A protracted war does not bode well at all for the Ukrainians, because their economy is shrinking massively. And there is also a chance of, again, the assistance fatigue from their Western allies, because their economies are also being affected by constantly supplying Ukraine with military and financial assistance that is worth billions of dollars. So at the moment, the protracted war is or might prove to be beneficial for Russia, but not for Ukraine at all. But things are still in a stalemate. Neither of the parties, the warring parties, they are neither having any sort of gain on ground, and they are also not ready for any sort of negotiations as well. So it is going to continue for the foreseeable future, in my humble opinion.
But Taimur, it's very important for us to understand that while Ukraine is getting all these fresh supplies from the entire West, we haven't heard any claims about Russia getting supplies from anywhere. And despite the fact that it's not receiving anything from anywhere outside, it's not dried out of ammunition so far, despite the fact that the war has taken too long. So what do you believe can be the reason behind?
Well, you have to understand that Russia, unlike Ukraine, has a huge and a very important and big military industrial complex. And they don't require that sort of assistance, especially the military assistance that Ukraine acquires and requires at the moment. An important thing to note here is that just the missile production capacity of Russia stands alone in capacity more as compared to the rest of the world that is producing missiles. So you can see that Russians have the capability to produce more missiles in a year as compared to the rest of the world. And their current strategy against Ukraine on field is also of massive missile attacks. And it is also proving very effective on the ground as well. So Russia does require some sort of military assistance, and it is already getting it from countries like North Korea and Iran. Although there were speculations that Russia might be getting any sort of military assistance or weapons from China, but in my opinion, and according to my research, I don't think so that there is any truth to that matter.
Taimur, lastly, I would want you to comment on a news item that has appeared in international media, which says that Russia is not allowing Ukraine to export its grain abroad despite an agreement that has been signed between the two sides. Do you have an update of this matter?
I think there is some sort of misunderstanding regarding this development because earlier this month, the grain export deal that was initially signed in July last year, it was renewed by Russia despite its reservations that it had about this grain deal. So Ukraine is able to supply its grain through the Turkish ports under the grain export deal that was signed. It has been renewed for the third time, although Russia had its reservations because it was saying that despite the clauses inside the agreement which states that Russian agricultural goods as well as fertilizers will also be exported under that deal. But due to companies not ensuring Russian products and Russian freights, and because of its isolation in the financial, you can say, system, as you know that Russia has been blocked out of the SWIFT system. So the mode of payments or the method of payment is also facing a lot of hindrances. So Russia had its reservations, but despite those, Russia renewed the deal earlier this month. So yes, Ukraine still continues to supply its grain under that deal.
Thank you very much, Taimur, for being guest in our program today. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with second segment of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. As you have been witnessing, that Iran is a country in our immediate neighborhood which is trying its level best to get its economy back into the mainstream, which has been adversely affected not only by inflation but also by the sanctions. Iran is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world. Russia has recently surpassed Iran in being the most sanctioned economy of the world. But since the sanctions are too old in case of Iran, and Europe has recently added some more sanctions to it, Iran's leadership is quite desperately working to look for a remedy. And in a spate of effort, recently, Ibrahim Raisi, the president of Islamic Republic of Iran, was on visit of Jakarta, where his team was with him to find out a possibility of boosting trade with Indonesia. It's very pertinent for us to understand that trade with Iran is very difficult because of these sanctions, and is becoming increasingly difficult with each additional round of sanctions that we are witnessing. To talk about this subject, I've invited an expert from Iran who was a part of President's entourage to Jakarta. Joining me from Tehran is Tawheed Asadi, a political commentator from University of Tehran. Tawheed Asadi, I welcome you to my show.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
Tawheed, you were a part of Iran's delegation recently. Tell us exactly what was happening in Jakarta. What was Iran's delegation up to?
Well, as you said, Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi paid a diplomatically fruitful visit to Indonesia with more than 10 agreements signed between the two countries, which I think it's going to pave the way for opening up a brand new chapter in the ties between Jakarta and Tehran. And actually, the agreements include a wide spectrum of spheres, including energy, cultural cooperation, visa facilities, technological and scientific cooperations, and the list goes on. But what tops this list, I think, is the preferential trade agreement that was signed between the two countries. Due to the complementarity of the economies of Iran and Indonesia, I think it's going to be a critically important event in the bilateral ties. And of course, we know that Iran is looking for a new policy on the basis of pivot to Asia, and this visit and this diplomatically important agreement signed between the two countries are all part of that. So what we expect is that this kind of enhancement in the ties between Indonesia and Iran is going to be just an initial step, not only in terms of the bilateral relations, but also in terms of Iran's intention towards having better relations with ASEAN and other Asian actually countries and unions, and actually everything that takes place in Asia has become very much important to Iran. And also in terms of neighboring policies, we have seen in the past year and a half a huge amount of shift in terms of foreign policy of Iran, in which the neighboring countries have become important. So almost simultaneously, Iran started diplomatic ties with Saudi Arabia, and it has started some efforts in order to improve ties with other regional countries and neighboring countries.
And it reminds me that recently Iran and Saudi Arabia have also inked a deal of normalizing their trade relationship as well as their diplomatic relationship. Now, isn't it a landmark achievement of its own, because both the countries have remained to be arch rivals of each other?
Well, I think the first and foremost significant reason due to which these two countries have decided to gather together diplomatically and improve the level of their shattered diplomatic relations is the perception and in-depth understanding, pertaining to the point that if these two countries can get together, the huge amount of power generated by this unionization, by this closeness, is going to be important for both sides. So I think there is now this profound perception that as long as these two countries could act together, could cooperate, and as long as they decide on independence of the region, it's going to pave the way for a certain huge amount of regional power, which is going to be dedicated to these two countries. And at the same time, I think there is this shift in Saudi Arabia that they have also decided to broaden the scope of their foreign policy partners. And also considering the fact that they have, I think, as far as I can understand, they have come with this understanding that their over-reliance on the United States and their being obedient of U.S. foreign policy for a period of time have put them in a lot of problems. So they are trying to act independently based on their own national interests. And then on the other side of the coin, we have Iran, which again knocked the door of Westerns for a decade or even more for actually negotiations that they had, and then the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was signed and sealed between Iran and some Western countries. But the result was something that brought Iran into a new understanding, and the fact that the West and the United States in particular is not reliable. So after rounds of talks, after these deals being met, Iran received nothing in return, economically speaking, when we're talking about tangible results, in spite of this reliance and this trust that they had in the West, and they signed the deal and they fulfilled all the commitments. So all in all, getting back to your question, I think there is now this common understanding both in Saudi Arabia and here in Iran that if they can have a certain, at least a minimum level of cooperation and mutual understanding, there is a huge amount of commonality and shared interest that could be followed after the two countries can get a little bit closer.
Tawheed, but Iran is facing sanctions, and these sanctions have made it very difficult for any country to trade with Iran. Now, how does Indonesia plan to come out of it? Because if they are going to normalize trade relationship with Iran, they can also become victims of US sanctions.
Well, I think that's a very smart question. But at the same time, I can say that Indonesians have already thought about that question. So for that reason, they have started a process of de-dollarization in their trade. And it's not limited to Iran. This de-dollarization and willingness towards using national currencies is something that they have already practiced with countries like China, Thailand, Japan, South Korea, and now Iran is on this list. So they have understood the fact that the United States foreign policy and their sanctions against countries like Iran are going to all for the benefit of the Americans. So while there is this risk that you mentioned, Indonesians and other countries are not that much willing to jeopardize their own economy in order for the U.S. sanctions to be imposed. So with this circumstance, I think, and on the other hand, there is this tendency towards Iran to do so, and they have practiced the same trajectory of trade without dollar with countries like Russia and China, and now they're trying to broaden this scope to include other countries. So Indonesians have agreed to do so because of, first of all, their own policies to de-dollarize their trade, and then because of the huge capacity that Iranian economy does have. And a third reason, I think, which is highly important, is the complementarity of two economies. For that reason, I think they have accepted to go through the trajectory of increasing the bilateral ties, economically speaking.
And lastly, Tawheed, don't you believe that Iran's strategy or Iran's foreign policy have entirely shifted over the last several years? Perhaps because of the economic meltdown that have caused a lot of resentment in public. And it appears as the leadership is now trying to look for way around smarter ways to connect to the rest of the world, circumventing the US imposed sanctions on Iran's economy.
Well, I think part of the story is related to the fact that Iran has been sanctioned and has faced some crippling sanctions targeting Iranian ordinary citizens. And at the same time, this over politicization of Iran has caused so many challenges for the country, including the situation in which the country has been overshadowed by politics, I think. So, what was interesting to me was that a huge part of the agreements that were signed between Iran and Indonesia were related to pharmaceutical corporations, technological corporations, scientific corporations, and Indonesians in some parts were very much surprised to hear about this marvelous advancements of Iranian science and technology. So I think now the country is trying to do this shift not only in a political term, but also in an economic term, and also in order for the world to get aware of the huge capacity of Iranian actually economy, Iranian technological advancements. And with all these being said, I think sanctions are perhaps the main reason why Iran is trying to expand its economic ties. But at the same time, it's exploring new opportunities to find new partners regardless of these sanctions.
Thank you very much, Tawheed Asadi, for being guest in our program today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was Tawheed Asadi telling us exactly about this visit and the background of this visit. I'm now joined by an expert from Lahore. His name is Osama Rizvi, one of most frequently appearing guests in my show, an expert of political economy who's going to tell us about the larger macroeconomic picture of Iran. Osama Rizvi, I welcome you to the show.
Thank you so much.
Osama, can you quickly give us a stock take or a background of the sanctions that Iran is facing today?
Certainly. So it all started from the Iranian Revolution back in 1979 when a mob, attacked the embassy, and as a result, United States imposed sanctions. Also, United States froze about 12 billion of assets of Iranian businessmen, government in the foreign markets. And then after that, in 1984 came another important sanction, which was when Iran was declared as an official sponsor of terrorism by the United States Security Council. And afterwards, it was 2007 when the uranium enrichment issue came to the surface, and the United States adopted a few different sanctions again. And then 2015 was another important one when actually this bittersweet relationship between Iran and United States sort of was, there was a rapprochement between both the countries in the form of the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is also known as the Iran deal. But when Trump came to the in the administration, he repealed it, he revoked it, he cancelled it, and now we stand here. Iran right now is the second most sanctioned country after Russia.
And do you agree, Usama, that Iran's political problems have exacerbated because of these sanctions, particularly during last 10 years?
Certainly. So it was back in 2017 when Iran posted its last economic growth figures. So after 2017, there has not been an economic growth in Iran. Iran's oil production have fallen to about 50 or 30 or 40% of what it was before the sanctions. Iran's trade surplus with the world, which used to be around $3 billion or something back in 2018, after the rapprochement that I just mentioned, it has now gone into a $6 billion deficit. Its global trade with other countries have also shrunk. The oil exports are not there. Even whatever oil Iran is exporting, it is being done through the shadow fleet, which does not get a lot of income. It does not get a good price. Also, Iran's inflation level is it's what we call as hyperinflation. So $1 is equal to I don't know how many million riyals or something like that. So that they are, just on the top of my head, a little bit about the Iranian economic sanctions. There is, however, another aspect of it as well that we do not see. Despite all these things, we have not seen the Iranian population falling apart. And there are different dimensions for that, but we're not going to discuss it right now. But yeah, there has been a considerable and significant impact on the Iranian economy after the sanctions.
Osama, will you agree that the trade sanctions have brought Iran to a point where its policies have clearly shifted from its strategic interests into the economic interests? Don't you believe that Iran's shift of policies clearly telling us that the policies are now more economic and trade centric in nature?
So we need to realize that, like any other country, there are some hardliners, some conservatives, and some forward-looking parties or people. So in Iran, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, that sort of is the hardliners, and they have at times taken a step back whenever there was a step forward from the other parts of the government or the people or electorate to normalize relations with other with its regional neighbors. However, post Russia-Ukrainian war and the development that Russia has now become the largest sanctioned country in the world, there has been now a shift in the whole geopolitical and the international trade orientation of the world, where we see China, Iran, Russia, Central Asia, Saudi Arabia, all of them becoming closer, bolstering their camaraderie, their friendship. And one of the representation of this change is through the use or the debate or the debate about using their own currencies. So, for instance, China-Russian pair has went up 39%, 40% in Russian stock exchange or foreign exchange markets for the previous 2 or 3 years. All of these countries are now in talks with other BRICS countries that they need to settle their trade amongst themselves in their own currencies or yuan. Russia and China's trade has gone up $52 billion in, I think, 1 year. Indian imports from Russia in terms of oil has jumped 530% only in April 2023 versus April 2022. So why am I telling all these figures? Because this show that a big change is afoot in the world, where we will see the concept of minilateralism, which is a very interesting idea actually, taking place. Small economic blocks of small economic countries led by bigger ones like China and Russia and India. So this is how I see the future. in the coming decades.
Thank you, Sama, for being guest in the show. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with the last segment of program. Stay with us. Welcome back. Ladies and gentlemen, Afghanistan is one of the recent developments in this region. In the last 3 years, we have seen many of the developments, but Afghanistan perhaps was the largest development. That's United States, a country that remained militarily active in Afghanistan, left the country in the hands of Taliban, a force that it was trying to wipe out from the political landscape of the country for straight 20 years. Taliban have not proven out to be very good partners for countries like Pakistan that had pinned very high hopes and have not been able to control the economy as well to a great extent. The West still have a lot of grievances in terms of girls' education and many other matters of human rights from Afghanistan. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why many countries still do not have an active embassy in the country. How Taliban are moving forward with governance. We have invited Major General retired Inamul Haq Sahab to the show, who writes frequently on this subject in Express Tribune and has authored many other publications as well. Inamul Haq Sahab, welcome to the show. Sir, Afghanistan was a country that was left entirely to Taliban by the United States because the United States failed militarily against Taliban. But when it comes to administration, it's a different ballgame altogether. How successful do you believe Taliban have been in this new ballgame that have come to them?
Shabbat, thank you very much. It's a very good question. And to my reckoning, the Afghan Taliban or the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan's reality as is perceived in the media, particularly in the Western media, is different from what the reality on ground is. I will give certain indicators and you can make out your own judgment from that. The first and the foremost requirement of the Afghanistan after the pullout of the United States was the peace and security of the country. They have delivered on that account. The second fear amongst the Afghan watchers for a very long time was the fracturing of Afghanistan and disintegration along ethnic lines. That has not happened, so they have delivered on that account. The third important indicator was border control. They have delivered on that account, and the border control is much more firm, with the exception of TTP. We'll come to that question later on. But so far, their border control is good, which is substantiated by the revenue collection. I'll give you some figures. The Afghan customs figure or the target for this year was 96 billion Afghan rupees. So far, they have collected 105.8 billion Afghan rupees, overshooting their target. And mind you, this is around 58% of the Afghanistan's budget. The fourth indicator, their trade with China, certain Asian republics, and Iran, it is going on very well. They have been able to control corruption to a great extent. That is why the purse or the federal kitty is increasing in size. Just as a small indicator, around 8 Polish tourists visited Panjshir in May, and there was some tourism, international tourism to the Bamiyan Valley also. And all across Afghanistan, development works is taking place. There is the hospital under construction in Namroz. There are dams, factories, other things which are happening. And this, mind you, is despite the US crunch, the US imposed crunch, where they have seized something like 9 billion Afghanistan's dollars in their accounts. So I think the ground reality is not as it is seen on the media. The only concern is about the education of the girls. And in that also, girls which are going to the private schools, they are attending the private schools. Girls which are attending schools and colleges in KP in Pakistan, they are doing it. The only thing is that the higher education in some provinces is not as it should have been. And for that, they cite the lack of resources to pay the teachers. And I think this is sort of a pressure tactics which is going on. They have signed a contract with a Turkish company for the supply of electricity to Afghanistan. The Chinese foreign minister in May met his counterpart Muttaqi. And the Asian Development Bank has committed $405 million for Afghanistan for health and education facilities, which is going to be dispersed through the UN agencies. And there are direct flights under consideration between Afghanistan and China. So I think the ground reality is much different from it is seen on the media. But having said that, there are still challenges which are left to be surmounted.
Also, Imam Sahib, the West expected Taliban to disintegrate. It didn't happen. Do you believe a disintegration of Taliban is still on cards?
Shabahat, I've been saying for a very long time that despite their ethnic fault lines, there is a sense of Afghani or being Afghan, which is very, very strong amongst Afghans of all ethnic groups and shades. So I think that is a binding thing. When you listen to the Taliban leaders or the IEA leaders these days, they talk about the reconstruction of the country, the healing of the country, and stuff like that. Taliban movement is a very big movement. It is deciferious, and it was at the grassroots level. And if you look at the history of the movement, there were two distinct groupings within the group. They still persist. One is the ideologues of the South, the Kandahar group, which are led by the Maulana Habatullah Akhundzada and the other people. These are the hardliners, religious people, and they are actually the movers and shakers in the Afghan government. And then in the north, we have the Khostwal group, the pragmatists. So these are the basic grouping within Taliban. Other than that, there are no groupings. And these groupings also, they see eyeball to one another on a lot of issues. There are no particular differences between them, which can be exploited by the others. The Shumal, which was the Achilles heel in all previous administrations, the Hadarajat and the Panjshir Valley and the northern areas, Kandod and all those other areas, Ratan, Baghlan, etc., they have been pacified and integrated into the Afghan Union. And I personally believe that the sense of Afghanness is very, very pronounced in the people of Afghanistan than it was any time before that. The fact of the matter is that all the previous warlords are enjoying life peacefully, staying in Kabul. The officials of the Ashraf Ghani government, they keep visiting Islamabad, and there are no restrictions, there are no exploitation of these people. So I think from here on, despite the Western efforts, especially the intelligence generated efforts by some countries, I believe that the unity of the Taliban or the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan will be not only will be kept intact, it will improve further.
And don't you agree with me if I say that Pakistan has been quite disappointed the way Taliban have run their country? Perhaps the way they have been sheltering and providing support to TTP. Don't you believe it's one of the major problems between the two countries?
Shabahat, actually, the Pak-Afghan relationship is very, very important. As we used to say that you can't wish away your geography, you can't wish away your neighbor. So you are stuck with your neighborhood. And in this neighborhood, as far as the bilateral relationship is concerned, I actually categorize it in two parts. One are the constants of our relationship, and the other are the variables of the relationship. What are the constants of our relationship? Geography, demography, religion, shared history, etc., and the peace dividend. These, through the trade and commerce, these are the constants of our relationship between the two countries. But what are the variables? The variable one, and one of the most important variable, is the TTP, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, and the other is the Durand line or the fencing issue between the two countries. The negotiations during last year failed because of over expectation on Pakistan's side, which were not pragmatic. Our expectations were beyond the capability and the potential of the IEA government to deliver. Now, Muttaqi came to Pakistan in April 23, and there were a lot of heart-to-heart talks with him. We got to understand the Afghanistan's position also on this. You see, the TTP was a bedfellow with the Taliban, Afghan Taliban, during their long fight against the Soviet Union and then the American forces.
In Amsab, China is still quite enthusiastic about normalizing relationship with Afghanistan. Just recently, they resumed a direct flight from Kabul to Beijing as well. Uh, what can be the reason behind it? And also tell us if it's going to subside the Indian influence from the country.
Shabahat, I think it's more than that. China has been interested in minerals and rare earths for a very long time, and Afghanistan has good deposits. That is why their investment in the Anak copper mine. So Afghanistan's untapped mineral resources, particularly the rare earths, is a big attraction for China. And that is the new game changer at the international level, as you are aware. The second reason is that China would want its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, to succeed and expand. It is already topping a couple $1 trillion, and it is spanning in its final shape to 128 countries across 4 continents. So it would not like that Afghanistan should be left out of the BRI at the Belt and Road Initiative. It's not only for commercial purposes, it gives China a lot of political and geostrategic clout also. So that is the reason. The third reason, to my mind, is that China is trying to emerge as a regional peacemaker. We saw their efforts in bringing Iran and Saudi Arabia together very successfully and very surprisingly to a lot of people. And now they are trying to sort of go for a conciliation between Ukraine and Russia. So China is a new acquired role of a regional peacemaker, and that is also one of their interest in Afghanistan. And if you narrow it down more, China's interest in Afghanistan is to secure a secure neighborhood for Pakistan. Because if the Pakistan is secure from any incursions or any mischief from the Afghan side, the CPEC, which is the pilot project of the BRI, would go unhindered without any problems. And that is most important for China, that the CPEC should go without any problems. And for that, they would like to have a secure neighborhood for Pakistan. So these are, to sum up, some of the interests that China had in Afghanistan. Indian factor is there, but I would not overplay it. It's a game of chess. Countries do that sort of a thing to minimize and to keep an eye on other people, especially the hostile countries. So that is there. But I think more than the Indian interest, it is the China's own interest which drives them towards closer relation between China and Pakistan. As I mentioned earlier, they are thinking about a direct fight between the two countries.
And lastly, do you believe that United States interest has completely evaporated from Afghanistan?
If you look at the American strategy papers, the consistent and continuous interest that they have in Afghanistan is that the country should not become a source of terrorism that attacks America and its allies now or in future. So that is their core interest with the Afghanistan. They would not like, they would keep an eye on Afghanistan, and they would not like it to sort of relapse into terrorism. And I doubt that that is going to happen. Having said that, they would also like to keep their over-the-horizon capability in the region, whether it is aircraft carrier-based or it is their bases, to intercede into any situation where terrorism threatens America or American allies, like we saw in the killing of al-Zawahiri last year. So that is their core interest. We got to understand that. And as a world power, which is generally a status quo power, America would not like a destabilize Afghanistan, which had the potential to destabilize the whole region, particularly a nuclear Pakistan next door. So those are the kind of interests that America would pursue. It is still pursuing. The Asian Development Bank's loan to Afghanistan and the other donor agencies which are still involved in Pakistan, Afghanistan through UN agencies are not without a blessing of by the Americans. And I think there are a lot of things happening at the private level also.
Thank you very much, Enamul Haq Saab, for being guest in the show.
Thank you, Shabahat. Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, Afghanistan remains to be one of the major problems in this region. It's a country that is still not stable, a country where still many militant organizations are active, and it has caused a lot of concerns to the neighboring countries like China, Russia, Central Asian republics, and Pakistan. Iran also has its own reservations. Now let's see how capably Taliban can overcome all of this. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.